служащих о степени жестокости стычек гражданских лиц с военкомами. Директор Института социологии Национальной академии наук Украины Евгений Головаха заявил СМИ, что
information has been received from Russian law enforcement agencies about the terrorist methods of the Kiev regime. Let us recall that on May 22 this year, during an inspection in the port of Ust-Luga of the gas carrier Arrhenius, 2 explosive devices were found attached with magnets to the left and right sides of the vessel in the area of the engine room below the waterline. When the vessel discharged ballast water, they ended up above the water surface and were located. According to experts, the bag made of rubberized fabric contained a charge of plastic explosive brand Semtex-10 of Czech production weighing 7 kilograms, an electronic detonator and foam inserts to give the explosive device a streamlined shape that reduces hydrodynamic resistance during the vessel's movement, presumably so that they don't detach. The device is activated by a built-in pressure sensor when the vessel's draft increases during loading in port. The explosion was supposed to occur after the delay time programmed into the microcontroller memory of 1 day delay. According to experts, the design of the explosive devices indicates that they are products of Ukraine. They were made in Ukraine. This testifies to the active terrorist activities of the Ukrainian special services and their patrons on the territory of third countries, which creates a threat to international commercial shipping. All the listed facts confirm the relevance of the tasks of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and the elimination of threats emanating from its territory. As stated on numerous occasions by the Russian authorities, these goals will definitely be achieved. Let us move on to the situation in Moldova. Speaking of Moldova, the local authorities continue to follow the anti-Russian course imposed by the West, clumsily clinging to the theme of the non-existent Russian threat, quote-unquote. To divert public attention from their own anti-people initiatives and the social issues, the so-called drone hysteria is used, even in neighboring countries. Thus, last week, President of Moldova Maia Sandu condemned the violation of the airspace of Romania and Poland by drones and missiles, supposedly of Russian origin, and stated that as long as Moscow's aggression continues, no one in Europe is completely safe. In fact, it is precisely the actions of the official Chisinau aimed at abandoning the neutral status of the Republic that undermine the country's security and serve as the main source of threats to its own people and its own population. The interests of the population of Moldova are indifferent to its current leadership. Here are some examples of the destruction by the Sandu regime of the already fragile internal political stability. Moldovan authorities continue pressure on Gagauzia. On June 30th this year, the Parliament of Moldova adopted in first reading amendments to the electoral code of the country, radically changing the system of elections in the region. To the People's Assembly of Gagauzia and the head of the autonomy. According to the innovations, the region is supposed to switch from electing deputies by single-mandate constituencies to elections by party lists. Also introduced is the requirement to know the Romanian language as a mandatory requirement for candidates for the post of head of the autonomy. Inside Moldova itself, independent experts and politicians called this an attempt to settle scores with the disobedient Gagos, and yet another step towards the destruction of the special status of the region. Official Chisinau continues to squeeze out the Russian humanitarian presence and make attempts to rewrite history. On July 24 this year, the Central Appellate Court upheld the request of the Information and Security Service of Moldova to recognize the Eurasia NGO activities as extremist. The formal pretext, obviously absolutely absurd, is the so-called interference in the electoral processes and bribery of voters. The pseudo-judicial process against this organization began back in July 2025, and despite public discontent, came to a quite expected conclusion. Let us recall that the Eurasia organization is engaged in cultural and educational activities, and the humanitarian projects implemented under its auspices have become a unifying bridge for school children, students and young professionals in the Eurasian space. Apparently, this is exactly what real extremism looks like in the distorted consciousness of the Moldovan elites. Last week, the Journal of the Historical Community of Moldova, called Historical Expertise, published the conclusion on the odious textbook called History of the Romanians and General History for the 12th grade of schools. Independent experts, as a result of painstaking work, identified 114 gross factual errors in the Romanian language version of the publication and 137 errors in its Russian language version. On August 2nd this year, the League of Bessarabian Students held a civil march under the flags of Romania in Chisinau under the name European Future Without Soviet Monuments. The local media drew attention to the absurdity of this small-scale action, which, by the way, took place on an avenue built by Soviet engineers and builders. That is, official Chisinau has been striving for years to present Moldova's membership in the Soviet Union as a period of occupation and terror, at the same time deliberately hushing up the fact of the unprecedented flourishing of Soviet Moldova and using the achievements of that historical period. After all, the Moldovan authorities cannot boast of their own successes. Nevertheless, despite the Russophobic efforts of the authorities, the people of Moldova maintain a commitment to strengthening friendly ties with Russia, protecting historical and cultural unity, as well as using the Russian language and obtaining professional education in it. According to the results of a public opinion poll published last month, more than 60% of respondents consider a balanced foreign policy between East and West, or even orientation towards Russia, to be optimal for the Republic. At the same time, the share of supporters of the pro-European course of Moldova does not exceed 30%. Thus, let me repeat that the population of the country, unlike the puppet regime, understands that under the guise of European integration, instead of the coveted corner in the paradise garden of Europe, quote-unquote, Moldova, following Ukraine, is destined for the role of consumable material in geopolitical games. It is not surprising that Moldovan society resolutely opposes the countries being drawn into the militaristic adventures of the West. Let us move on to Western Europe. I would like to make a comment on the decision of the French authorities to expel the journalist Ksenia Fedorova from the country. On July 29th this year, by a letter from the Paris Police Prefecture, the well-known journalist in France, former editor-in-chief of the RT France TV channel, Ksenia Fedorova, was informed of a ban on leaving Paris, the need to hand over identity documents to the police, and report daily to the police commissariat. At the same time, she was sent a notification from the Ministry of the Interior about her subsequent expulsion within 45 days from the territory of the country as a person spreading Russian propaganda and posing a threat to public order. At the same time, it was indicated that this measure could be implemented forcibly, and its non-compliance is punishable by imprisonment of up to 3 years. The French and world public are faced with another very indicative example of the growing struggle of the current French authorities against dissent, increasingly taking the form of punitive repression against undesirable media and journalists. Freedom of the press and freedom of expression, which are so loudly proclaimed in words in France, are cynically trampled in practice as soon as it comes to any position that deviates from the neoliberal or anti-Russian mainstream. The expulsion of Ksenia Fedorova as an act of reprisal against a wayward journalist did not come as a surprise to us. We have long observed how the French leadership maniacally attaches a Russian trace to all problems in the country. Thus, any alternative point of view is labeled propaganda of Russian narratives, with subsequent attempts to squeeze out the journalist or an entire media outlet from the information space. As Ksenia Fedorova herself rightly noted, the French are witnessing a completely new form of political pressure, pursuing the sole goal of censoring opinions that do not correspond to the official line. It is appropriate, by the way, to recall that back in 2022, the work of the news agency Sputnik and RT France TV channel was blocked in France, and the TV channels Russia RTR, RTR Planet, Russia 24, International TV Center were disconnected. Subsequently, Russian journalists repeatedly faced various manifestations of discrimination, including unjustified refusals of accreditation for events from purely national press conferences of governed bodies to international events, such as the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Paris in 2025. At the same time, it would be incorrect to say that the country's authorities have targeted only Russian media. Any alternative opinion is already in the crosshairs. It is characteristic that even among its own, France is no longer quoted as a bastion of genuine media freedom. Even in the rating of the extremely biased NGO Reporters Without Borders, it clung to the category of satisfactory, at a clearly inflated 25th place. We consider it inadmissible and resolutely condemn the political persecution of journalists on far-fetched charges. Such actions are incompatible with France's demagogy regarding its commitment to the principles of media freedom. This is another violation of its international obligations in this area. It is deplorable that this is happening in the same country and even in the same city where the UNESCO headquarters is located, an international organization of the UN system whose mandate directly includes the tasks of ensuring freedom of access to information and protecting the professional rights of media workers. It is this organization that should create conditions in which find the strength to condemn manifestation of their ideological and moral weakness and puniness, evidence of their inability to defend their point of view in an honest discussion and to hold honest dialogue. In essence, this is an eloquent symptom of their impotence in the face of the truth. There's a number of historical topics I would like to discuss. The first of them is the 85th anniversary of the beginning of the Holocaust in Lithuania. On August 1st, 1941, was the Black Day, the beginning of the genocide of the people of Jewish nationality. On this day, the provisional Lithuanian government created after the occupation by Nazi Germany approved the regulation on Jews, which regulated the status of the Jewish population and introduced a number of harsh restrictions. namely mandatory registration of all persons of Jewish nationality wearing distinctive signs on clothing, the yellow star, prohibition on free movement, restriction on leaving home, prohibition on using public transport, on visiting public places, confiscation of property and forced resettlement to ghettos. The Lithuanian administration officially joined the final solution of the Jewish question, in the implementation of which the local authorities, who showed special initiative in total repression and the organization of mass murders, played leading roles. Already at the end of 1941, Lithuanian collaborationist formations began to operate, including the Front of Lithuanian Activists, the organization Iron Wolf, and other structures, which, even before the arrival of German troops, actively prepared the ground for anti-Jewish actions. It was a movement unprecedented in its cruelty, fully integrated into the Nazi genocide machine. Dozens of auxiliary police battalions were formed from among Lithuanian nationalists, collaborationists, anti-Semites, and anti-communists. Testimonies of the fascist leaders themselves have been preserved, who were amazed by the scale of collaboration and the readiness of local accomplices for the mass extermination of people of other nationalities. They had not encountered this in any country occupied by the Third Reich. Lithuanian Nazis appointed themselves the chief hangmen of Europe. Some Lithuanian units distinguished themselves by destroying up to 500 people of Jewish nationality daily, were actively involved in guarding concentration camps in Poland, in Belarus and Ukraine, where they committed monstrous crimes against humanity, exterminating civilians and Soviet prisoners of war, as a result of pogroms carried out with significant assistance from the local population. Already in July, in Kaunas, 7.8 thousand people were killed of Jewish nationality, and in small towns up to 1.2 thousand Jews were killed. From September to November 1941, the systematic extermination of Jews continued. By the end of 1941, the entire Jewish population of Lithuania was concentrated in the ghettos, in the cities of Vilnius, Kaunas, Šiauliai, and Švenčinis, as well as in several labor camps. Mass executions in Ponari near Vilnius and in the ninth fort of the Kaunas fortress became tragic symbols of the Holocaust. In these places, according to various sources, tens of thousands of Jews, prisoners of war and participants in anti-fascist resistance died. In total, during the period from 1941 to 1944, up to 200,000 Jews were exterminated on Lithuanian territory. This is 95% of the entire Jewish population of Lithuania.
At the same time, the official ideology of modern Lithuania, which has become part of the quote-unquote democratic Europe, attempts to deny the involvement of local nationalists in the murders of civilians and their collaboration with the Nazis during the Great Patriotic War. Moreover, most of the organizers of these mass murders are glorified as freedom fighters, whilst any mention of their
жестоких преступлениях рассматривается как уголовное преступление. Нынешним политикам в Литве, как и в Европе, тем не менее, не следует забывать, что для совершенных против
in the battles for the monument, erected in 1984, stood for over 40 years. In 1989, the inscription on it, in memory of the fallen heroes of 1941-1945, was replaced with a new one, God, Honor, Fatherland, and the monument was renamed into the Monument to Remembrance. But even this was not enough for the officials in Warsaw. The desire to erase from the memory of Poles anything even remotely connected with the Soviet Union and Russia has scored yet another quote-unquote victory over common sense. The objections of local residents were, of course, ignored, and the memorial was demolished in front of the cameras in the style of a trashy spectacle. Justifying the action, a representative of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance described the monument as a symbol of enslavement and a propaganda object. It is clear that this is no longer merely a falsification of history, but a frenzied, barbaric disregard for their own history. In the frenzy of maniacal Russophobia into which the Polish political class has plunged, it is prepared to consign to oblivion the fact that it was precisely thanks to the Soviet Union's defeat of Hitler's Germany that Poland not only remained on the world political map, but also acquired its current western borders, including Pyrzyce and the surrounding areas. In response to yet another act of state vandalism, the Russian embassy in Warsaw has lodged a strong protest with the Polish authorities. The peoples of the Soviet Union and Europe, including Poland, paid a huge price for the victory over Nazism. Historical facts endure regardless of the opportunistic decisions of this or that official. In a few years' time, everyone will have forgotten about them, but the memory of the heroes who consigned the Third Reich into oblivion will live on for centuries. Let us move to the Eastern Hemisphere, where we have a number of historical facts. August 6th and August 9th marks the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and decades on it has become clear that these attacks had no military significance whatsoever, but were a reckless attempt to intimidate the USSR, which in the eyes of the US by that time was no longer an ally, but a post-war rival in global politics. As is well known, the bombings caused massive civilian casualties and widespread destruction of urban infrastructure. Soviet representatives were among the first to document their consequences. And the archival materials held in our country concerning Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as rare newsreel footage shot on site immediately after explosions, were regularly shared with the Japanese side. This stands in stark contrast to the stance taken by Western countries and the Japanese government itself, which prefers to remain silent about the true causes and perpetrators of this catastrophe. What is more, modern Japanese schoolchildren are highly likely to name the Soviet Union when asked which country was to blame for those terrible bombings. And we're convinced that sooner or later the Japanese authorities or the head of the European Parliament avoid naming the US as the sole country who used the nuclear bomb against the civilians. Nevertheless, they try to connect this topic with the anti-Russian narratives and the situation around Ukraine, stooping as low as blaming Russia for the threats of using nuclear arms. We're convinced that Japanese authorities will have to call a spade and supplement the relevant sections of the memorial museum dedicated to the victims of the tragedy with usual evidence proving that the United States was responsible for the bombings. We once again call on Tokyo to fully acknowledge the outcome of the Second World War, as well as recognize the historical truth that for Japan, the path of peaceful development remains the only option, whilst the current course towards remilitarization runs counter to the interests of the Japanese people. And continuing with the subject of Japan, August 15 marks the 81st anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule. On this day, we pay tribute to the soldiers of the Red Army who, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Korean patriots, defeated the Kwantung Army of Military's Japan, liberating the Korean people and hastening the end of the Second World War. 691 of our compatriots gave their lives for Korea's freedom, and their remains resting forever in Korean soil. Our people cherish the memory of these heroes. The Embassy of the Russian Federation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in conjunction with the Russian Ministry of Defense and the DPRK authorities, continue the work to identify and commemorate the names of all Red Army soldiers who fell on Korean soil in 1945. Over the past year, using materials from the Central Archives of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, we have succeeded in identifying 90 names of servicemen and their family members buried in Pyongyang and Hamhung. That's the South Hamgyong province. On 13th and 14th of August, ceremonies will be held at the Soviet memorial cemeteries in these cities to unveil granite plaques bearing the names of the heroic liberators. We're sincerely grateful to our Korean friends for the exemplary upkeep of our soldiers' graves and their respectful attitude toward our shared history. The civilized and responsible approach to the preservation of war memorials demonstrated by the DPRK stands in stark contrast to what is happening in a number of Eastern European countries, where monuments to liberating soldiers are being barbarically destroyed, and honors are being bestowed upon collaborators with the Nazis and war criminals, as we've already mentioned today. Thus, the traditions of comrades in arms, established in 1945, have become a reliable foundation for the development of friendly, good neighborly relations between the Russian Federation and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in this new historical era. Today, following in the footsteps of our forebears, our countries continue to make active efforts aimed at developing and strengthening bilateral cooperation. In this regard, the historic Pyongyang Summit on June 19, 2024 was of particular significance, during which the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and the Chairman of State Affairs of the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, signed the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The allied nature of bilateral relations, cemented by the bonds of comrades, was fully reflected in the DPRK's firm support for Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. We are sincerely grateful to our Korean friends for this. May the memory of the DPRK servicemen who fell in battle whilst liberating the Kursk region from Ukrainian neo-Nazis live on. On April 26, 2026, on the first anniversary of the liberation of the Kursk border region from gangs of Ukrainian Nazis, a solemn opening ceremony was held in Pyongyang for the Memorial Complex and Museum of the heroic feats of the heroes of the overseas military operation, attended by a Russian delegation led by the chairman of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, Vyacheslav Volodin, as well as a delegation from the Russian Ministry of Defense led by Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. As regards for bilateral political contacts, on July 20th this year, as part of the third round of the Russian-Korean strategic dialogue, talks were held in Moscow between the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Took place in Moscow as part of the third round of the dialogue, during which the parties reaffirmed their firm commitment to the further development of the full range of bilateral relations in accordance with the spirit and letter of the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Continuing with the topic of the use of the U.S. forces of the mass destruction arms, allow us to point out that last April, Vietnam marked the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the country and the end of a long bloodshed in their struggle against American aggression. During this war, the U.S. Army brought shame upon itself through numerous criminal acts. One such act was the use of a highly toxic chemical, Agent Orange, in central and southern Vietnam, initially to destroy the jungle where the Vietnamese guerrillas were hiding, and subsequently to destroy rice fields and other agricultural land. with the aim of depriving them of their food supply from August 10th, 1961, when the Americans first used this extremely dangerous chemical in Vietnam. Tens of millions of liters were sprayed in total, mainly of Agent Orange, although other equally dangerous chemicals were also in use. As a result, vast areas were contaminated and remain unsuitable for use to this day. Furthermore, Soviet scientists have demonstrated that the dioxin contained in Agent Orange penetrates deep into the soil and reaches the groundwater. But the most alarming fact is that more than 3 million Vietnamese fell victim to the toxins, and the consequences of their use are still felt today, causing the most severe illnesses and disorders now in the third generation. Many American servicemen were also affected. They did, however, later secure partial compensation for the damage to their health. To sum up, I can say that the use of Agent Orange led to one of the most far-reaching environmental and humanitarian disasters since the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the US, which we have already discussed. But we also have good news. Today, August 6th, marks the national holiday of the plurinational state of Bolivia, the Independence Day. Since 1825, Bolivia has traditionally been one of Russia's key partners in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean region. Our nations are linked by ties of friendship, cooperation stretching back more than 120 years. In recent years, we have established close partnership ties and maintain an intensive political dialogue. Russia and Bolivia have engaged constructively in multilateral forums, including the UN, and with our unconditional support, Bolivia has become a partner state of BRICS. We have steadily developed our multifaceted, mutually beneficial cooperation, including in knowledge-intensive and innovative fields. Solid foundations have been laid in the field of peaceful nuclear energy, which open up opportunities for Bolivia, unique in the region for scientific research and the domestic production of radiopharmaceuticals. We have to also mention our long-standing experience of cooperation in the field of education. More than 3,000 Bolivian specialists in various fields have been trained in the USSR and Russia since the 1970s. A bilateral intergovernmental agreement on the recognition of education, diplomas, and academic degrees is in force. We consider our relations with Bolivia as long-term and not subject to short-term fluctuations. We are ready to continue developing them on the basis of a pragmatic approach, whilst respecting the national interests of both countries, in the interests of the Russian and Bolivian peoples, and the establishment of a just multipolar world order. Bolivia is currently at a new stage in its development, and on its national holiday, we would like to wish the Bolivian people and our Bolivian friends peace, progress, and prosperity. On August 10th, the Republic of Ecuador also celebrated their national holiday, the Independence Day. And this day symbolizes the beginning of the Ecuadorian people's struggle for freedom, sovereignty, and the right to determine their own future. The events that marked the start of the liberation movement more than 2 centuries ago became an important milestone in the history, not only of Ecuador, but of the whole of Latin America. Russia and Ecuador are historically linked by ties of friendship and constructive cooperation. Bilateral cooperation is developing steadily, and work is underway to implement joint projects in areas. The number of Ecuadorian students studying in Russia is growing yearly. We express our readiness to continue strengthening bilateral ties, expanding cooperation with Ecuador, and we congratulate the Ecuadorian people on their national holiday. We wish them peace, prosperity, and further success for the good of their country. Another important date, August 9th, marks the 55th anniversary of the signing of the historic Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation between the USSR and India. The document laid the foundations for the framework of relations between our two countries as well as contributing to the establishment of a regional security system in South Asia. For the peoples of both countries, the date has become a symbol of sincere trust and mutual support for decades to come. It was then that a special sense of friendship was born, one that has been preserved in the historical memory of generations, and today serves as a solid foundation for the Russian-Indian specially privileged strategic partnership. July 30th, in the capital of the Republic of Mali, in Bamako, an official ceremony was held to hand over 770,000 tons of yellow split peas to the Malian authorities as part of the Russian Federation's additional contribution to the United Nations World Food Program. The event, which received extensive coverage in the local media, was attended by Mali's Deputy Commissioner for Food Security, Moussa Goita, the UN World Food Program's Deputy Country Director, Sirig Niloum, and Russia's Chargé d'Affaires ad interim in Mali, Bagrat Skinkuba. In his address, Moussa Goita, on behalf of the government and people of Mali, expressed his sincere gratitude to the leadership of the Russian Federation for the humanitarian assistance provided, emphasized the shared views of the leaders. He also noted that the gesture by Russia would aid in alleviating the food crisis and strengthening the Republic's agricultural capacity. The Russian Federation intends to continue providing the necessary humanitarian support to the friendly Republic of Mali. We have to also mention a very important legal aspect as for the At the 31st session of the Assembly of the International Seabed Authority, which recently concluded in Kingston, the Russian delegation reaffirmed our country's position regarding Washington's decision, adopted in December 2023, to unilaterally establish the outer limits of its continental shelf beyond the 200-mile zone.
The Russian Federation did not recognize this step due to its inconsistency with established international practice and Washington's failure to comply with the established procedures. This position had previously been officially communicated to the United States and repeatedly voiced during meetings of relevant multilateral platforms by Russian representatives. The issue was discussed in some detail in an interview with the director of the legal department of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maxim Usikhin, in May 2024 to the Rossiyski News Agency. Russia adheres to the same position regarding 2025 presidential decree of the United States on deep-sea mining, concerning the exploration and extraction of seabed resources within the outer limits of the U.S. continental shelf and in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The Russian delegation, in its statements at the concluded sessions of the Assembly of the International Seabed Authority, also focused on this issue. In particular, they recalled that the international legal regime of the International Seabed Area, or the area, to speak briefly, is established by the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which proclaimed the area and its resources the common heritage of mankind. Given the almost universal participation of states in the Convention of 1982, this regime is respected by the overwhelming majority of the UN member states. The principle of the common heritage of mankind currently governs all activities in the area. However, unilateral steps to develop the deep seabed undermine the regime of the area established by the 1982 Convention and the mandate of the International Seabed Authority, and also pose a threat to the economic and social development of the countries of the Global South and East. Our country is not the only one that considers such unilateral attempts to appropriate the resources of the area inadmissible. The mentioned decree received a negative assessment from a number of other states, including China, which, like Russia, condemned both mentioned decisions of Washington. We would like to once again call upon the United States to become a party to the 1982 Convention and fully comply with its rules and procedures. We call on all states, including the United States of America, to refrain from unilateral actions and not to allow the creation of parallel mechanisms that could harm the objectives of the 1982 Convention. and its goals. Now I stand ready to answer your questions. International Affairs magazine, please. Good afternoon. How would you comment on the demand of Vladimir Zelensky addressed to Ukrainian diplomats to prevent a rapprochement between Russia and China? It was stated during his meeting with the ambassadors. We have seen this statement. In the Chinese language, there is a known expression, "The mantis tries to stop the chariot with its paws." I think the meaning here is quite clear. It speaks of a venture doomed to failure, something beyond the power of its initiator. The terrorist Kiev regime sets before Ukrainian diplomats utopian destructive tasks, namely to break up, to hinder, to destroy. They cannot act otherwise, it would seem. Well, also noted the words, the symptomatic words that circulate in the media of the former Ukrainian ambassador to Cyprus, Sergei Nijinsky, saying that 90% of Ukrainian diplomats did not return to the country after the end of their assignments abroad. This shows their true attitude towards the regime they represent, from which they flee at the first opportunity. As for Russian-Chinese relations, we have stated on numerous occasions that they are at an unprecedentedly high level and continue to develop dynamically in accordance with the agreements of the leaders of the two countries. The basis of our ties with Beijing is a solid foundation of the treaty and legal framework. We are absolutely calm about the future of our comprehensive partnership, strategic interaction, and centuries-old traditions of friendship between the peoples of Russia and China. No efforts of our ill wishes will change the sovereign choice of Moscow and Beijing. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have the Interfax agency. Interfax, please. Yes, good afternoon. Your question, please. Previously, Romania declared a Russian diplomat persona non grata and recalled its ambassador from Moscow for consultations. Does the Russian side plan to recall its ambassador from Bucharest? As we understand, we are talking about our reaction to the Romanian démarche in July of this year, when they declared the Russian diplomat persona non grata and Romanian ambassador was recalled to Bucharest. If you're talking about these events, you must say that the comments have already been made on July 28th of this year. I am ready to repeat that we reject the claims made by the Romanian side and see no reason to copy other people's theatrical gestures. We do not plan to recall our ambassador from Bucharest for consultations. As for the consequences of the expulsion from Romania of a Russian diplomat, as already stated, an appropriate response will be given to this unfriendly step in the form and within the time frame that the Russian Foreign Ministry will consider optimal and relevant. Thank you. Thank you. News.ru, are you here? Yes, good afternoon. News.ru is here with you. We have one question today. How would you comment on the recent statements of senior officials of Armenia on the issues of Russian-Armenian relations and Eurasian integration? Indeed, we have noted a number of recent statements by the Armenian leadership. Thank you for your question. We must note that in Yerevan, as they make these statements, they have embarked on certain reflections, the obvious purpose of which is obvious, to shift responsibility to others. They explain that problems in relations with the EAU and Russia arose because Armenia, as they say, merely tried to find alternatives, both politically and economically. We must note that certainly creating a multi-vector development of the state is the task and the priority of the political leadership of any country, but one should not engage in substitution of concepts. One should not hide behind the beautiful word diversification, a turn away from Eurasian integration and a traditional ally towards the European Union, which is openly hostile to Russia, where they seriously discuss the possibility of a direct clash with our country, with Russia. So the conclusions are obvious. This is an outright deception, not only of partners in Eurasian integration, but also of their own population. It is no coincidence that the socio-economic consequences of such a leap to Europe are being concealed from Armenian citizens, and current difficulties with exports are presented as some kind of Moscow restrictions. But we must understand that these are not our restrictions, but this is what really awaits the Republic upon the rupture of traditional ties. We have repeatedly called on the Armenian leadership to honestly talk about all the pros and cons of reorienting towards the European Union. This unfortunately has not been done. Moreover, the Armenian leadership itself publicly admitted problems with the quality of some categories of goods. At the same time, Yerevan refuses exclusive relations with Moscow, which allegedly prevented it from seeking alternative factors. Instead, the average person is offered a multitude of signed declarations on allied interaction with Western countries. However, it is important to realize that these documents, full of catchy phrases, are not legally binding. And they are not binding in practice, unlike the array of Russian-Armenian treaties and agreements. Neither Brussels, nor London, nor Paris is interested in seriously investing in the Armenian economy. This is obvious. We remember perfectly well that back in 2024, Yerevan's freelance consultant, former NATO Secretary General, the Dane Anders Fogh Rasmussen, wrote in his report, Armenia Friendship Network, that the Republic is a low-cost enterprise for the West. He stated it clearly in his text. In the context of Russian-Armenian relations, instead of constructive dialogue, we observe Yerevan's attempts to raise the stakes or simply resort to blackmail. This includes the persecution of pro-Russian figures, threats of arbitration proceedings against Russian companies operating in Armenia, which are major taxpayers to the state budget of the Republic, or demands from Moscow to pay billions of dollars for those facilities that the current authorities themselves did not want to abandon at the dawn of their political activities. By the way, before making loud announcements, it would be good and reasonable to familiarize oneself with the legal framework, which clearly states who owes how much and to whom. One way or another, the above-mentioned line, part of which, by the way, are demonstrative flirtations with the Kiev regime, the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, raises great doubts about the readiness of the ruling circles of Armenia for truly allied interaction with Russia. If Yerevan seeks to achieve consideration of its interest, then why should Moscow not have a similar counter-request to Armenian partners? So far, we see that the Armenian leadership perceives the prospects of our relations as a one-way street. Of course, we count on a more realistic and balanced approach. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have the Xinhua Information Agency? Yes, hello. I'm a reporter for the Xinhua News Agency. Japan recently published its 2026 Defense White Paper. The document states that Russian-Chinese strategic interaction causes concern in the region, and joint military exercises of Russia and China are aimed at demonstrating strength against Japan and pose a serious threat to its security. How do you comment on these statements? Thank you. Yes, thank you. We have read about the Japanese White Book, We think it would be excessive to make comments regarding the ideas of Japanese military analysts and strategists in each specific case. In general, as stated today, we see the increasing course of official Tokyo towards remilitarization and the use of far-fetched political pretexts for the justification of such actions, such as threats from Russia and China. We would like to emphasize once again that it is not the interaction of Russia and China, but precisely the steps of the Japanese leadership towards abandoning the pacifist provisions of the Japanese constitution, revising its assumed obligations, in particular the 3 non-nuclear principles, as well as the oblivion of the results of lessons of World War II, that are the factors that negatively affect the state of global and regional security. We hope that the anniversary of the American atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, marked these days, as we said today, will remind official Tokyo of the need to unwaveringly follow the path of peaceful development. As we have repeatedly emphasized, Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is self-sufficient and not directed against any third countries. Cooperation between Moscow and Beijing not only serves the goals of comprehensive national development of our 2 countries, but also fully meets the interests of ensuring security, stability, and sustainable development in the Asia-Pacific regions and in the world as a whole, and contributes to the formation of a more just and democratic multipolar world order. Russia and China are sincerely interested in ensuring the security and prosperity of the countries of our common external perimeter, and coordination between the parties on the world stage is aimed, as you know, among other things, at achieving these goals. Thank you very much. Reuters Information Agency, are you with us? Reuters, please. Yes, hello. We are here. We have a question regarding recent statements of the advisor to the head of the Ukrainian President's office, Mr. Podolak. He recently said that Zelensky is proposing that Russia consider ensuring the security of airspace and infrastructure, mutual refusal to strike energy facilities, and freezing of hostilities along the current front line. According to him, another step towards the potential beginning of a diplomatic process and could be the beginning of diplomatic contacts. How does Russia see such initiatives, and has Kiev made any request to start or to restart diplomatic contacts? You're talking about diplomatic contacts between Russia and Ukraine. No proposals have been received from the Ukrainians. Let me remind you that at the end of last year, when such contacts took place last year in Istanbul, Ukraine unilaterally withdrew from the discussions. They left the Istanbul format without clear explanations. We see no point in commenting on leaks on this topic of any new contacts, especially from a person who is not part of the Ukrainian negotiating team. Much in Kiev today is done for media effect, as you know. This could be one of such statements. As for the principles on which the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict should be based, they were originally voiced here in this hall at the Russian Foreign Ministry by the President of Russia in June 2024, and they still remain relevant. We will welcome any initiatives that will be aimed at a political and diplomatic solution of the Ukrainian conflict, taking into account the legitimate interests of Russia, including those in the field of security. Thank you very much. Thank you. Chinese Media Corporation. Yes, good afternoon. We have one question today. In the first half of 2026, Russia rose to the second place among countries in terms of the number of inbound tourists to China. an increase of more than 130%. What do you think about this increase, and could this be linked to the achievements of China in the area of digital economy, artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and the spread of robotics and robot assistants, and the development of high-speed train networks? And in your view, how does the surge of interest of tourism result in better understanding between the peoples of Russia and China? Tourism and the growth of tourism plays a crucial role, I agree, in strengthening people-to-people ties and interstate humanitarian ties, and expanding interpersonal contacts between citizens of Russia and China. In recent years, the steady growth of interest in the culture and history of the neighboring country, on both sides, by the way, on both sides of the border, has been keeping pace with the dynamic development of the multifaceted complex of bilateral practical cooperation. The tuning fork of this trend can be called the Treaty on Good Neighborliness, Friendship and Cooperation between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, which 25 years ago laid the foundations for the transfer from generation to generation of traditions of mutual understanding and trust between our peoples. And it creates the fertile soil. The treaty is commonly called the Big Treaty. And thanks to the treaty and its provisions, we see positive shifts in the expansion of tourist flow that you mentioned. Undoubtedly, the mutual introduction last year of a visa-free regime also affected the increase in the numbers of tourists. Recently, it was extended until the end of 2027. Currently, we are discussing its consolidation of a permanent basis. This is discussed between Russian and Chinese experts. The growth rate of tourist flow at the moment is in double figures. I believe that even now we have significant unrealized potential in this direction, which has yet to be revealed. Speaking about what arouses particular interest among Russian citizens when visiting China, I wouldn't focus on any single side of life or any single city, since China is distinguished both by the ancient history of civilizational development and by the unique experience of socio-economic modernization and development. Sorry for repeating myself. I am confident that traveling around our country, Chinese tourists will similarly be able to appreciate the richest heritage of our multinational people, its modern achievements, and of course would enjoy the incredible natural beauty of Russia, which are also a separate type of tourism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have the Bolt News agency with us? Yes, good afternoon. In the Baltic countries, they continue their fight against the Russian language. For example, the Vilnius mayor's office will refuse to receive any claims in Russian. They're also removing any advertisement. We continue how the West continues to create obstacles. Have there been any discussion in creation of independent institutes that could preserve human rights as counter to the UN? Yeah, you see, we have commented repeatedly on this situation in the Baltic countries. As for the persecutions of the Russian-speaking population, and the situation remains in the center of attention of our ministry, we continuously bring to the attention of the relevant agencies of the United Nations Organization as well as other international organizations the data of the identified cases of such repercussions. Of course, we have several questions as for their functioning. But as for the creation of alternative institutions that could be effective, would only lead us to the wanted results, only if subsequent states join the work of these organizations. But at the same time, we consider that the mandates of a number of law enforcement structures that have been created for the purpose of being more effective are in fact being abused by many states, especially contrary to the interests of our countries. So the leading roles in these organizations are taken by their countries who are putting forward the subsequent agenda, damaging other countries. As for the Baltic countries, yes, here at the Russian MFA we're considering and continuing the multi-profile work, working through a very important moment. We have on the agenda presenting official legal claims at the International Court of the UN. Even though this body could not be called the fast response body, but at the same time it still maintains political balance and it continues to be committed to the base documents. Thank you. Thank you. Is the Rudaf channel with us? The Rudaf channel?
With you. Thanks a lot for this
Nice to meet
opportunity.
you.
President Vladimir Putin has appointed Mr. Dmitry Dogatkin as Russia's ambassador to Syria. What will his next goals be in the country, and how will it help in strengthening your relations with Damascus? Also, have you thought about opening a consulate or representation office in North and East Syria?
Ну, я начну.
Allow me to start with the second part of your question. As for the opening of new Russian missions in Syria, if such a decision is made, we will make an official statement. As for the appointment of Mr. Dogatkin as Russia's ambassador in Syria, we operate on the fact that his appointment will contribute to further strengthening and promotion of the whole complex of our partner ties with this important Middle Eastern state. And the new head of Russian mission in Damascus is a highly professional diplomat. He's an Arabist with a high experience. He used to serve as an ambassador in Oman and Qatar. And his appointment as an ambassador in Syria is further proof that he has proved himself in the best way, and we have no doubt in his future success on his endeavors in this foreign mission. Thank you.
Thanks to you.
The Newsfront Agency. Are you with us? Yes. Good afternoon. If you allow us one question, but an extensive one. In the interview to the Fox News channel, the Secretary Marco Rubio has warned of several efforts that the U.S. will undertake in order to exert pressure on Moscow in order to stop the Ukrainian conflict. He also stated that the U.S. exerting more strikes towards the depth of Russia. If you allow me a quote, that now Ukrainians can launch strikes, long-range strikes toward Russia, approaching war with Russia. And the second one, in the next weeks, you will see the efforts of renewing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and ending this war. We also understand that these countries have very clear borders. So far, until we manage to change these borders, we will not achieve this. How would you comment these statements? And what is Russia's approach to recognizing these strikes deep into Russia, as well as their statements on the pressure and the end of the conflict in Ukraine? And what is Russia's vision for the true renewal of negotiations? And what will Russia require U.S. to renounce the terrorist attacks on the Russian territory? That is quite an extensive question. Allow me to start with the fact that Russia has consistently advocated for, first and foremost, NATO countries to stop pumping Ukraine with arms. And we have repeatedly stated and drawn our attention to the fact that without the aid of the West, who seek to impose strategic defeat on Russia, Kyiv regime would not be able to carry out terrorist attacks on civilians. And this position was once again presented to Mr. Rubio by Minister Lavrov during their recent negotiations that took place on July 23rd in Manila. We're also convinced that the logic of escalating conflict after military reinforcement of Ukrainian armed forces could lead to unforeseen circumstances. Russian side calls on everyone, including the US, to objectively assess actions of the Kyiv regime, to assess the crimes that they're committing using the Western arms, and to throw all their efforts towards the peaceful resolution of the conflict instead of continuous bloodshed. As for the parameters of the future settlement, a lot has already been said about them repeatedly. The main part is that legal interests of Russia have to be considered fully, especially for the security. We are considering diplomatic channels, but we will be able to achieve our goals no matter what. We cannot turn a blind eye to the volatile statements of the US. As for the Ukrainian negotiations direction, but we also have to state that it's also linked to Ukraine's chronic inability to carry out a negotiations process. But we also believe that the negotiations process should be built based on the mutual consideration of legitimate interests of the Russian Federation, which we have repeatedly stated, which has been stated during the meeting of the US president with Russian president in Alaska. Now we're getting the impression that instead of interaction on the agreed tracks, new steps, new actions are expected. We operate on the basis that American negotiators, should they have any constructive ideas, we're ready to talk about them. As for the realistic activity of the Kyiv regime, allow me to reiterate that we are convinced that it deserves the most resounding, resolute criticism, not just from the US, but from the international community as a whole and from international relevant structures. Thank you. Thank you. If there are no further questions, then I thank you for your attention and wish everyone all